Hello, I'm Dami Coker, and welcome to this ERI Scientific Beta webinar. As you know, today's topic is bottom-up versus top-down approaches, and we're going to be looking at what the best methods are for constructing multi-factor indices. Joining me today is Felix Goltz, who is Research Director with Scientific Beta. So please follow the materials which we will be sharing with you on screen, and if you have a question, do send it to us through your webinar interface, and we will try to answer it before the end of today's session. So let's begin by moving on to our introductory slide. Now, as a bit of background, within multi-factor investing, a top-down approach assembles multi-factor portfolios by combining distinct sleeves or indices for each factor. Bottom-up approaches, on the other hand, build portfolios by choosing or weighting securities using a composite measure of multi-factor exposures. Now, the main advantages of top-down approaches are that they allow investors to make explicit choices regarding the factors to which they wish to be exposed. Also, they're quite flexible as they allow investors a certain level of factor-by-factor control. And they are also consistent with the Smart Beta 2.0 framework developed by Scientific Beta, which allows investors to choose desired exposure to factor risks while diversifying away unwanted and unrewarded specific risk. However, there are some advocates for bottom-up approaches who say that cross-factor interactions are not accounted for in top-down approaches. So today, Felix is going to present a novel approach from Scientific Beta that takes cross-factor interactions into account within a top-down framework. So Felix, as I just mentioned, we mentioned cross-factor interactions. Can you explain, first of all, what you mean by this term and how exactly do you account for them in a top-down framework?
Yeah, so the idea behind looking at cross-factor interactions is simply to look at not only the exposures to a given factor that we may be tilting to explicitly, but also to the residual factors. So if you design, for example, a value factor index, well, that value factor index will also have exposure to other factors like momentum, quality-related factors, and so forth. Likewise, if you design, for example, a momentum index, that will have exposure to momentum, but also to these residual factors. So if then you combine a standalone value index with a standalone momentum index, and you ignore these cross-factor interactions, you may end up with an overall factor exposure that may not be as high as you would like it to be across the different factors. So that's really the idea behind accounting for cross-factor interaction. The question is, can we actually take into account multiple factors at the same time when we construct factor indices? Now, you can take into account these cross-factor interactions by using a composite score across different factors, and there are basically two different approaches to doing that. So a first approach is to simply eliminate the factor losers. So you can look at a factor index and look at these residual factors and try to remove stocks that have very low exposure to additional factors. Another philosophy would be to say that, well, you will actually try to gain high exposure to the so-called factor champions, the stocks that have high exposure on multiple factors. So this is an interesting question. What is actually an interesting approach? Is it actually of interest to concentrate in factor champions, or does it make more sense to just eliminate the factor losers? So I provide a simple illustration here to look at this question. We just looked at champions and losers using different definitions. What you can see here is that when you account for cross-factor interactions, it's actually very attractive to do that by eliminating the factor losers. So you can see that factor losers have actually a very strong underperformance, and they have very negative factor intensity. So factor intensity being just the sum of all the relevant factor exposures. On the other hand, if you look at the factor champions, you can see that factor champions do, of course, have positive outperformance. They do have positive factor intensity, but these are actually much lower in magnitude than the corresponding negative value for the factor losers. So because of this asymmetry here, it actually is more interesting to eliminate the factor losers than it is to actually concentrate in the factor champions. And so at Scientific Beta, we've been using this insight to apply a filter to our smart factor indices, and this filter effectively achieves that we're taking into account this cross-factor interaction in our top-down single factor indices. So you have an overview here of how this construction works. So our standard single factor indices will just tilt to a desired factor by selecting half the stocks in the universe based on that factor score, say value. And after that, the standard indices will actually apply a range of diversification-based weighting schemes to come up with a well-diversified factor index, or what we call smart factor index. Now what we are doing here is we're just adding a filter. So we're filtering out the factor losers. We're filtering out 40% of the stocks by their multi-factor score. That makes us end up with 30% of the stocks, and then we apply our diversification-based weighting scheme. So within the existing framework, the existing method of our indices, we just have a new type of filter which we're using to remove the factor losers. Now the results that we get from that are very much in line with what you expect. So we can see that effectively applying that high factor exposure filter allows increasing the factor intensity of the index. So you have a comparison here of the multi-factor combination using single factor indices without this high factor exposure filter. And then we're comparing that to the corresponding indices that use the high factor exposure filter. So you can see that the factor intensity actually increases substantially. And you can also see that these indices become more different from cat-weighted indices, not just because of the higher factor intensity, but that also translates into higher tracking error. So tracking error increases with the high factor exposure filter. Relative returns also increase, and you also see benefits in terms of the Sharpe ratio.
Okay, great. So when accounting for cross-factor exposure, what you're saying is that the goal is to capture the residual exposure to desired factors, essentially. But you've shown us now the results for the top-down approach, but did you compare them to the bottom-up approach, and well, what conclusions did you draw from that?
Yeah, so we ran actually quite an extensive comparison between these top-down approaches and different bottom-up approaches. So this is quite an extensive comparison because we didn't just want to compare two cases. So there's different ways of constructing bottom-up indices. There's different possible allocations and ways of designing top-down indices. So we're looking at a range of possible strategies. So first of all, the top-down approaches. So we're testing everything on long-term US data. You have an overview here of the top-down approaches. So they are based on scientific beta smart factor indices. Some of these approaches are based on the indices without the high factor exposure filter, and then we're looking at the indices with a high factor exposure filter. So overall, there are three different approaches that we look at. The first one is a simple diversified multi-beta multi-strategy index. So we're looking at indices for 6 factors using the 5 different weighting schemes. So that's a total of 30 single factor, single weighting scheme indices, and we simply equal weight across these indices. So in that first version, there is no high factor exposure filter. We then look at the same index, this time drawing on the components with a high factor exposure filter. Otherwise, the allocation method is the same. And then we're also looking at a third case. This is a diversified maximum factor exposure index. So this draws again on the ingredients with a high factor exposure filter, but now this runs a dynamic allocation across these indices. The objective of the dynamic allocation is actually to increase the overall multi-factor score of that allocation by dynamically allocating across the different ingredients. So this is an explicit optimization objective of maximizing the factor exposure, drawing on these different smart factor indices. So these are 3 different ways of actually benefiting from multi-factor exposure in a top-down framework. And now we're comparing this at different bottom-up approaches. So the bottom-up approaches we look at are all score-weighted indices. So the idea behind bottom indices is to take into account this exposure to multiple factors and the cross-factor interactions at the stock level, at the individual stock level, and then reweight stocks by their composite factor score. So this is our score weighting methodology, which corresponds to standard practice in the industry. I'm using different ways of calculating the scores, just because there's different ways of doing that in the industry. So when you average the factor exposure across factors to come up with a composite score. You can use an arithmetic average, you can use a geometric average. So both of these methods are employed in practice. So we're looking at both of them. And also we were interested in looking at more or less concentrated bottom-up approaches. So we're looking at different levels of stock selection, again selecting stocks directly by their composite score. And we're looking at a 50% stock selection, and we're also looking at a 20% stock selection to have a more concentrated portfolio.
Okay, so you're saying that you're concentrating more on the concentrated bottom-up approaches, and given they are very concentrated, that might pose some investability challenges. Likewise, the dynamic allocation in the top-down framework could increase turnover, for instance. So how does investability compare across the two approaches?
Yeah, so it's interesting to look at investability. So we just analyzed quite simple investability metrics, which are shown here. So if you just look at turnover, for example, you can see that the more concentrated bottom-up approaches actually have very high levels of turnover. So they reach turnover of in the range of 60 to almost 90%. If you compare that to the top-down approaches, if you look at the simple equal weighted allocations, they only have turnover in the range of 30% roughly. Even with a dynamic allocation, turnover goes to levels slightly above 50%, but actually still stays below the levels of the concentrated bottom-up approaches. So this result is quite intuitive, because what you do in the bottom-up approaches is you're really trying to concentrate to get strong factor exposure. And of course, if you concentrate to have strong factor exposure, you're also going to get a lot of turnover. These factor exposures at the stock level are definitely not stable, and so as scores change at the stock level, you're going to mechanically change the weights, and so you're going to generate a lot of turnover up to levels of almost 90%. Now you can look at additional metrics. So we also looked at the days to trade in the different strategies, but the results here are quite similar. So even in terms of days to trade, if you look at the concentrated bottom-up approaches, the number of days you need actually to trade these positions are about 2 to 3 times what we have in the top-down approaches. So we can see that this idea of generating strong factor exposure in a concentrated bottom-up portfolio does actually lead to investability challenges. So you have relatively high turnover, and you have kind of high number of days to trade, which actually means that it'll be difficult to implement these at kind of a high level of assets.
Now, given that these bottom-up approaches are more concentrated, we would assume that they achieve higher factor exposures, but they are less diversified at the same time. So can we measure the benefits of diversification across the different indices? And if so, using what metrics do you use?
Yeah, so I mean, intuitively, it's quite clear that with a top-down approach, especially if you draw on well-diversified indices, you will get a higher level of actually diversification. And of course, if your objective is to concentrate to get strong factor exposure, you will actually sacrifice diversification by construction. So the question is, how do we measure that? Well, we actually looked at a whole range of diversification metrics. Some of them are listed here. I will just focus on a few of these metrics and provide some results. So it's interesting to look at the idiosyncratic risk and also the idiosyncratic risk-adjusted return of these strategies. Why is that interesting? Well, simply because you can break down risk and return into what is explained by the factors and what is explained by something else, what is not explained by the factors. And of course, these multi-factor portfolios actually seek exposure to factors, and so if investors are interested in allocating to these multi-factor portfolios, they shouldn't have issues with risk and return that is explained by the factors, because precisely you're looking for these factor exposures. It's entirely different with idiosyncratic risk. Idiosyncratic risk is unexplained by the factors, and so it's not something that you're actually seeking to obtain. Of course, idiosyncratic risk is not expected to be rewarded. It's completely unrelated to these rewarded factors. And yet, if you think about highly concentrated approaches, it's plausible that you will actually get idiosyncratic risk on top of the actual factor risk that you're getting, because you end up being concentrated in a few stocks. You may get sector risk, you may get kind of firm level risks which are not explained by the factors. So we look at idiosyncratic risk, and of course high idiosyncratic risk would imply a lack of diversification. We also look at idiosyncratic risk-adjusted return. So once you strip out the factors, of course, it would be beneficial to have a high risk-adjusted return on the component that is unrelated to the factors. So we have some results across the different strategies. And if you look at idiosyncratic risk, the results are quite clear. So you can see that there are quite high levels of idiosyncratic risk in the concentrated bottom-up approaches. If you look at the levels here, you have levels clearly above 5% for the most concentrated bottom-up indices. If you compare that to the top-down indices all have idiosyncratic risk levels in the order of 3%. So you can see that by increasing concentration in these bottom-up indices, of course, you expect to get more factor exposure, but you also get more risk that is completely unrelated to the factors. And so in that sense, you're sacrificing diversification. And again, this is quite pronounced in magnitude, moving from about 3% in the top-down approaches to more than 5% in the bottom-up approaches, in the most concentrated ones. Likewise, if you look at the idiosyncratic risk-adjusted return, you can see that this metric is actually higher for all of the top-down approaches compared to actually any of the bottom-up approaches. So in terms of diversification, you can see that all three top-down approaches actually have better metrics than the bottom-up approaches. If you look at a more simple measure, you could simply look at the effective number of stocks. So the effective number of stocks is just a measure of how balanced the weights are across the different stocks. And here too, you see a drastic difference. So with the top-down approaches, you get something like 150 to about 300 in terms of effective number, whereas with the concentrated bottom-up approaches, you end up with something like 30 to about 50 effective stocks. And so you can see that you have a high level of concentration, and that translates into this high level of idiosyncratic risk.
Right. So we have a range of metrics then with different scores to examine diversification. But the ultimate goal was to gain factor exposure. So what metrics do you have to measure this? Do you use factor intensity, or is that relevant, or do you have any other factor metrics that you examine?
Yeah, so the starting point behind these bottom-up approaches is clearly the factor intensity. So kind of the key argument behind concentrated bottom-up approaches is that the objective is somehow to increase the factor intensity. But of course, factor intensity is not an objective per se. So if you evaluate a portfolio, I can't think of any case where ex post the evaluation would be based on the factor intensity. So evaluation would be based on risk return of the portfolio, much more likely than the factor intensity. So factor intensity is kind of the starting point. That's why these bottom-up approaches kind of have been designed. They set out to find high factor intensity, but of course, high factor intensity is not an objective per se. And so the relevant question is really, well, do you capture that factor intensity in an efficient way? Okay, so are there actually benefits to increasing the factor intensity when you actually look at risk return as well? So we are looking at this idea of efficient capture of the factor intensity using different metrics. Again, I won't go into all of the metrics, but one metric which is very simple and quite intuitive is simply what is actually the excess return per unit of factor intensity. So the idea behind this is that, well, if I increase the factor intensity by concentrating the portfolio more, but I don't get a proportional increase in returns, then I'm not doing this increase in an efficient way. So it's interesting to look at the excess return per unit of factor intensity. You can also look at the balance of the factor exposures. So across the different factors, how balanced is actually exposure, and the idea is that you likely wish not only to be to increase your exposure to multiple factors, but also to be exposed in a balanced way across the factors. So these are some of the metrics that we can look at. The results, again, are quite interesting when you look at the different top-down and bottom-up approaches. So first of all, just if you look at the factor intensity, you can see kind of an obvious result. So the concentrated bottom-up approaches are actually the ones that achieve the highest factor intensity. So they have factor intensities here of about 1, or levels higher than 1, whereas the top-down approaches actually reach a level of 0.75 at most. So by concentrating into few stocks with high multi-factor exposure, of course, you do get high factor intensity. Now, the question is, what is the efficiency of this factor intensity? And for this, we can look at the excess return per unit of factor intensity. Now, here you see a different picture. So you can see that actually all of the top-down approaches have higher measures than the bottom-up approaches. So if you look at the top-down approaches, per unit of factor intensity, they generate excess return of about 5%, greater than 5%. And for the bottom-up approaches, these excess returns are actually lower. So that means with the bottom-up approaches here, you do get higher factor intensity, but you don't actually get the corresponding level of return. Now, what that means is that ultimately, even if you wanted to increase your factor intensity to those levels of about 1 or slightly larger than 1, you could actually use the top-down indices and simply allocate more to these indices, and you could actually reach the same level of factor intensity, but you would actually have better risk-adjusted return at that level of factor intensity. So there's another metric that we looked at where we basically create a benchmark portfolio that uses these indices here and adjusts them to obtain the highest factor intensity, which is 1.08 here of the narrow bottom-up index, and then we look at the resulting Sharpe ratio. And you see that at that level of factor intensity, you actually obtain a higher Sharpe ratio with all of the top-down indices. So again, this suggests that the bottom-up indices are actually not efficient in capturing the factor intensity. So yes, they do capture high factor intensity, but they do that in an inefficient way.
Okay, so factor intensity in itself is not a goal. It's important to look at the efficiency. Okay, and so now we've looked at these differences in diversification and in terms of factor exposure, but how do they influence the performance of the indices and the risk as well?
Yeah, so we looked at the performance across the different approaches. Now, what you can see in terms of performance is actually in line with what we've seen on the efficiency of factor capture, for example. So if you look at just the outperformance, the relative return, you can see that the concentrated bottom-up approaches have the highest relative return. They have the highest outperformance among the indices that we're looking at here. So for the most concentrated approaches, you get outperformance of more than 4% annual. Okay, for the top-down approaches, outperformance is in the range of about 3% to about 3.7%. So you do get the higher outperformance from these high levels of factor intensity, but you also get high levels of relative risk. So if you look, for example, at the extreme occurrences of underperformance that have occurred, so the extreme relative returns, you can see that this reaches levels of about 13% losses in a given year for the concentrated bottom-up approaches. So you have to be prepared to take these kind of losses in certain years to reach that high level of outperformance. If you look at the top-down indices, they have extreme relative returns, in the range of 7% loss, 8% loss, and so this is much lower than for the concentrated bottom-up approaches. You have a similar picture when you look at the tracking error. And so what you can see in the end is that concentrating in these factor champions in the bottom-up approaches does give you kind of a slight increase in outperformance, but it gives you a strong increase in relative risk. So in the end, on a risk-adjusted basis, you can actually see that the top-down approaches achieve better results. So the information ratios actually are higher for the three top-down indices than for any of the bottom-up indices. And this just kind of confirms what we saw on the efficiency of the factor capture. Okay, so the information ratios here just show that, yes, you do get higher return with the concentrated bottom-up approaches, but you get more than proportionally higher risks. So on a risk-adjusted basis, there's actually no benefit to actually concentrating in a bottom-up approach.
All right, so in terms of risk-adjusted returns, these top-down approaches are more efficient than the bottom-up approaches. But in terms of the concentrated bottom-up approaches, they're further removed from the cap-weighted indices in terms of tracking error, higher factor intensity. Now, let's talk about stability. Are these high factor exposures, are they stable over time?
Yeah, so stability is an interesting issue. And again, intuitively, what you would expect from bottom-up approach, you have no reason to think that the factor exposures are stable. So actually what you do is you're just looking at the multiple exposures, to multiple factors at the stock level, and then you're going to tilt to stocks that have a high composite score, but these scores are not stable over time. And also by creating this composite, stocks may rank highly on a composite score, but you don't actually know why is that the case. Is it because of exposure to one factor or exposure to another factor? It's just kind of you're just lumping together all these factor exposures. In contrast, for the top-down approaches, you're actually maintaining separate sleeves for the different factors. So you have somewhat control over the different factor exposures, and so you would actually expect that fluctuations may be more well behaved in a top-down approach. So if you look at the results, you can just look at the aggregate numbers. So there's a metric that allows to look at that, which is the so-called score drift. So that just tells you how the exposures to the different factors vary over time. And you see that on this measure that the concentrated bottom-up approaches have much more instability, have much larger drift than the top-down approaches. So on this metric, you can see that for the most concentrated approaches, the drift is actually twice as large roughly than for most of the top-down approaches. It's interesting also to go down to the factor level and look at the variations over time. So these are just the time-varying factor exposures for a concentrated bottom-up approach on the left-hand side, and then this is compared to a top-down approach on the right-hand side. And you can clearly see that the variations are much larger in the bottom-up approach. If you take an example, so you can take the example of the momentum exposure. So that's the green line in these graphs. On the left-hand side, for this concentrated bottom-up approach, you can see that momentum exposure, is actually sometimes negative, so it reaches levels of something like minus 0.1. And in one period, it actually reaches levels of about 0.5. So you can see there's a kind of a huge amplitude in terms of how it varies over time. So it goes from minus 0.1 to plus 0.5. If you look at the momentum exposure on the right-hand side in the top-down portfolio, you can see that momentum exposure here varies roughly from about 0 to about 0.2. So you can see that the kind of the amplitude, the amount of fluctuation is actually much lower. And this is just one of the factors. If you look at the other factors, you find quite similar results. I mean, just look at the value exposure. So this is denoted with HML in the graph. So HML, or high minus low, is the value factor exposure. So you can see that this can be about 0 or even slightly negative. And then it reaches, towards the later period, it reaches a spike of about 0.8. So clearly, depending on the time period, you're getting kind of very different exposures to different types of factors, and that just shows the great amount of instability in these bottom-up approaches.
Okay, thank you, Felix. So to summarize, diversified top-down approaches are efficient and they're flexible. Bottom-up approaches that solely focus on increasing factor score intensity can lead to inefficiency in capturing factor premia because they have significant exposure to unwanted risks. They might also come with high instability and high turnover. But as we have shown, cross-factor interactions can be accounted for in a top-down framework. Scientific Beta does this by making an adjustment at the stock level using the high factor exposure filter. And the result may be lower factor intensity, but better risk-adjusted performance, shown by higher levels of diversification and higher returns per unit of factor intensity. So now we will be taking some questions that you have sent to us. And remember, you can still send them to us if you have the time. So Felix, let me ask you some questions from the audience. Now, the first one seems to concern data mining. And it says, when using dynamic allocation and the high factor exposure filter, do you not increase the risk of data mining in your indices?
Yeah, so if you use a composite multi-factor score, it's been shown that this leads to a larger risk of data mining in principle. The question then is, how do you actually use that composite multi-factor score? So in the high factor exposure filter, you're simply using the multi-factor score to actually eliminate the factor losers. Okay, so you're not going to rely on that. You're not over-exploiting the information in the multi-factor score. In contrast, if you look to concentrated bottom-up approaches, well, here you're actually using the multi-factor score directly at the stock level to actually weight the stocks directly by that score. So you're making much more intense use of that score. Okay. And so if there's a risk that, depending on how exactly you define that score, you may get different results, and that gives you possibilities of doing data mining, then that risk is present very much in bottom-up approaches. It's actually much less an issue for top-down approaches because we're just using a filter to eliminate the losers, so this will not depend kind of very intensely on how exactly you define the score. Also, how kind of sensitive you are and how exposed to data mining risk will depend on the level of diversification. So if you use a composite score, again, just to filter out some stocks, but you maintain a high level of diversification, changing the score definition will not lead to big changes in the portfolios because they are well-diversified portfolios. If, however, you use that composite score to concentrate very heavily in kind of the winners, the champion stocks on that score, then obviously your results will depend very strongly on how you define the score, and so concentrated approaches will suffer much more from data mining risks than well-diversified approaches.
Okay, so data mining is potentially more an issue for the bottom-up approaches than top-down. Okay, let's see what further questions we have. Here's the second one. It says, geometric averaging should lead to more efficiency because you multiply the factor scores, and that thus do not dilute the exposure by averaging across factors. So what differences do you find between arithmetic and geometric averaging?
Yeah, so we actually tried both of these approaches. We didn't actually find a big difference between using either the geometric or the arithmetic averaging. I mean, if you go back to the results that we presented, they actually behave quite similarly. If you look at the efficiency, so we discussed this excess return that you have per unit of factor exposure. Well, arithmetic averaging actually led to better results than the geometric averaging. So there's sometimes, a lot of kind of emphasis in the discussion is put on the fact that, for some reason it would be better to actually multiply the different factor exposures to the different factors rather than actually add them up. But ultimately, we don't see important results in the data, and actually the results are more in favor of arithmetic averaging than geometric averaging. There may be a simple explanation behind that, which is just in kind of a technical issue with geometric averaging at the stock level. So it actually turns out that when you do this multiplication at the stock level to assign stock level scores, and you select the stocks with the highest scores, well, this does not actually lead to improving the score at the portfolio level. So this geometric average doesn't actually translate in a straightforward way from the stock level to the portfolio level. So ultimately, it makes more sense probably to weight and select stocks by an arithmetic average. And what the results suggest clearly is that it doesn't make a big difference, but arithmetic averaging, when using this in a stock level bottom-up approach, has a slight advantage over this multiplicative composite score.
Okay. We have a few more questions here. So here's the next one. It says, with a top 20% of stocks versus top 50% of stocks approach, you're more concentrated on factors. Now, in that case, the decay of the factor exposure is also probably higher or faster. Have you tested whether a more concentrated factor portfolio needs more rebalancing? So the question on rebalancing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is what we find. So we actually looked at these two levels precisely because we didn't want to test one particular specification, but we wanted to look at different possibilities. And so yes, very clearly what we find in comparing the 50% stock selection to the 20% stock selection, what we find clearly is that the higher factor intensities of the more concentrated portfolios do actually require higher rebalancing, and so this also leads to higher turnover compared to the portfolios that actually hold 50% of the stocks. So because of the instability of the underlying scores, the more you try to actually concentrate to achieve a high level of the score, the more kind of turnover you're also going to generate.
Okay. Let's see if we have time for a couple more. Now this one relates to the stock selection methodology. It asks why not use the 50% filter in the second step. How about picking stocks with the top 50% composite factor scores and then apply the 5 weighting schemes dynamically?
Yeah, so the question is really what is kind of the objective of the filter? And so the objective in the top-down approach and the way in which we designed it is clearly that the objective is to have the primary factor exposure. And so say in a value index, we will make sure that all of the stocks have above average, if you will, above median value characteristics. And then we're simply going to filter out stocks with unfavorable residual exposures. But the primary objective is the value factor exposure. And you can see in the data, if you look at the factor exposures, you can see that the value factor exposure is actually clearly the dominant exposure. So even if you don't use the high factor exposure filter, you look at the value smart factor index, the value exposure is really what dominates across the different factor exposure. And then you can kind of adjust the residual exposures by that high factor exposure filter. But clearly the primary objective is the explicit tilt which that index achieves. And so this is why we follow this process, because there's an explicit objective. And now what that means is also that when you want to design a multi-factor allocation, so we just talked about simple equal-weighted allocations, but when you design these multi-factor allocations, you can also emphasize certain type of exposures more or less. So this actually becomes quite straightforward. So if you increase, for example, the weight of the value factor index in your multi-factor allocation, you can increase your value exposure in quite a straightforward way. And so you can actually adapt your allocation to emphasize any of these factors because the indices are defined primarily by their explicit factor exposure.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question. And here we go. So it says, when you eliminate the factor losers, are you making the single factor index more momentum oriented?
Oh, so yeah, so just maybe to explain this, so the way in which we define the factor losers is simply to look at an arithmetic average score across the relevant factors. So these are 5 factors in our case. So that actually includes the momentum factor. It includes the other factors like investability, value, low risk, and the profitability factor. And so the resulting exposures to these 5 factors will actually increase on average relative to the index that doesn't have the filter. So when we say factor winners, it actually just means stocks with high exposure on multiple factors. So we're not looking at the past returns. So we're not selecting winners in terms of past returns, or we're not eliminating losers in past returns. We're simply eliminating the stock with poor exposure to multiple factors. And so that will increase the overall exposure of the factor intensity on all of these factors. There's no kind of particular bias to any specific factor.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. So thank you once again, Felix, for joining us. So that concludes today's webinar on the merits of top-down versus bottom-up approaches in multi-factor investing. We hope you found it interesting. We've recently published a white paper on this topic called Accounting for Cross-Factor Interactions in Multi-Factor Portfolios. It's available on our website, www.scientificbeta.com. And we'll send it to you with the link to access it, where you'll also be able to download the slides in this presentation. And if you have a question that was not answered or that you did not yet ask, you can send it to us by email to webinar@scientificbeta.com, and we'll be sure to respond to you as soon as we can. So please remember to look for us on social media. We are on LinkedIn, and our Twitter handle is @scientificbeta. You can also now find us on YouTube by searching for the Smart Beta Solutions channel, where you can rewatch our webinars. As always, thank you for watching, and goodbye.